way before I was born, there was my mum and my dad, and they met in a time of their life when my mum was doing really well, successful, never touched any drugs, never drunk, never caused any trouble with crime. And then my dad, on the other hand, before she met him, he was into drugs, he was into gun crime, he was into violence, and that was just his life. So looking at that as an outsider, you would look at them and never ever put them together. And then, but one day, my dad decided that he'd had enough. He had got his life together, and he actually started to do well for himself. So my mum met my dad in a point in his life when life was going good, and so he was a good guy. He was working hard. He was doing what he needed to do to provide for his family. But the nature of drugs and the cycle of drugs sometimes creeps back in. And so he started drinking heavily again. He started getting abusive, started getting violent towards my mum. And then he had two children with my mum, which is my two older brothers. And they were brought up in this chaotic lifestyle where my dad was not only abusive to my mum, but he was abusive to my brothers too. And so some of the, just this is so you can get a bit of an idea of the background of where I've came from. Billy Graham said this once. He said, when an artist paints a picture, for him to truly emphasize the light in the picture, he has to paint a darker background. And so that's what I want to do today. I want to paint a dark background to emphasize the light more for you. And so here we have my two older brothers being brought up in this dysfunctional family where my dad would play mind games. So instead of hitting my brothers while they had done something wrong, he would get them to hold the yellow pages with their arms straight and their backs up against the wall, and they would have to stand there, and the first one to drop their arms below would end up getting beaten with a branch off a tree out the back. And so that was the kind of lifestyle that they were living. But then on top of this, not only were they getting punished and getting beat up and all of these sort of things, they were also being led into a life of crime as well. As I mentioned earlier, my dad was involved in guns. He had criminal records for carrying firearms and selling guns and doing all sorts of crazy stuff, hanging around with some crazy people. At this point, we lived in a place called Pembroke Docks. And in Pembroke Docks, it's got a massive gypsy community. And my dad was very much a part of that. So there was all sorts of stuff, dodgy dealings and crime going on. And then we have, on the other side of this, a woman, my mother, who had never touched drugs, never drunk a drop of alcohol, by all accounts was a saint, not a Christian, but, she was a good woman. And yet she was a shell of her former self. She was a broken woman. She had suffered at the hands of his abuse and violence. I remember my mum saying to me one day, David, I haven't got one real tooth in my mouth because of your dad, because he knocked them all out. And one of my earliest memories of my dad after I was born was actually coming down the stairs in the middle of the night, hearing a massive argument going off. And I peered through the slats on the stairs. And as I looked through, he had my mum up by the throat, and my mum was smashing a glass over his head. And so I'm like 5 years of age at this point. And this is the turmoil that I was brought up in. And so I'm watching my oldest brothers really resenting my dad. My mum couldn't say boo to a goose, and she could barely look after herself, let alone look after his boys. But she did all she could by all the means she could to make sure we were fed and looked after. And it must have been hell for her. Really, it must have been hell for her. And then so my brothers slowly but surely started getting more involved with the police. Police started bringing them home. At this point, I'm still 5-6 years of age. My dad was disappearing, going off wherever, whenever. And then one day he came back home, and I was sat on my mum's lap, and my mum was smoking at this point, which I don't advise. But she was smoking with me sat on her lap as a young child. And my dad came in and he started to punch me and my mum. He was drunk. He was off his face. And there was blood being shed. So my mum tried to hide me down the side of the sofa. So she's pushing me down in the gap of this big, soft, cushiony sofa. And as she does that, he punches the cigarette out of her mouth. And the cigarette cherries fly everywhere. They start burning me. They start burning my mum. And my mum physically grabs him and gouges his eye out. So I'm 5 or 6 years of age, and all I've ever experienced was my mum broken, my brother's into drugs and crime, and my father violent and viciously attacking us constantly. And then I see something that will live with me for the rest of my life, which was my dad's eye being gouged out of his head. And so it was the only thing she knew to do to protect me and my brothers. And so that night, the police came in. They took my dad. He got arrested. Thankfully, it gave me and my mum and my brothers an opportunity to get away. And so we moved away from Pembroke Docks at this point to a place a little bit further away. How many of you know that sometimes just moving from where you are to another place doesn't really get rid of the problem, especially if you are the problem? And so, we thought maybe changing where we lived might change the way we lived. But actually, all we did was carry the baggage of the lifestyle that we lived with us. And so my mum's still a broken woman, still hurting, still crying out for love, with two uncontrollable older brothers and a young boy, me, David, at the time, so scared that I just did not know what to do. And I started to become a product of my own environment. If you are hang around with so many people for so long, you start to become like them people. I say a comment now, and I use it all the time. If you want to become a good man of God, hang around with good men of God, because they rub off on you. And well, it works on the opposite end of the scale too. And so we were hanging around with the wrong people in the wrong places, doing the wrong things. And I became like my oldest brothers. And so some of my earliest memories, again, with my brothers, was running out, and we broke into this beach cafe in North Wales. And we all hid upstairs in the attic, and we lit a fire, and we were all smoking cigarettes and cannabis. And at this point, I was 8 years of age, and somebody decided to kick the bin over. And the old polyester carpets that you used to get, well, if you flicked a match on one of them, they go up like wildfire. Well, it did happen, and it went up like wildfire. So we all tried to run down this attic stairs, got outside, and the whole building went up in flames. And this was probably the first criminal offence that I was actually a part of. Now, I'm not saying that I committed the offence, but I was definitely a part of the group that committed the offence. We burnt down the beach cafe, we ran off, we later on got caught by the police, and because I was a minor, I didn't get in trouble for kicking the bin over. My brothers did, because they were looking after me at the time. And that was kind of the beginning of where I found that my identity was found in the things that I did, or the reputation that I gained actually made me feel good about myself. Because let's see, there was many of people doing plenty of things and building a reputation for themselves, and actually where I lived at the time, that looked good. And so I thought to myself, well, I can be like that. I can be a bit of a gangster. I can go and cause trouble. I can do this. And so 8 years of age, I burned down a beach cafe. And by about 10 years of age, I'm hanging around with two of my mates, Simon and David, and we're smoking cannabis straight after school, robbing some of his older brother's weed, and we're hiding in bushes, and we're smoking cannabis and just doing what kids shouldn't be doing, really. And thinking that we kind of knew it all and that we were gangsters. And see, the issue is that when you start something, it usually becomes a stepping stone into something else. And so for me, it was cannabis at the age of 10. And it didn't just stop there. So I started committing petty thefts to provide for my addiction. So smoking cigarettes and smoking cannabis came at a cost. So I used to go into the local B&Q, and I would run around the back of the local B&Q, and I'd throw things over the fences, like pen knives, like gardening tools, and then I'd go and sell them to my neighbors. So I was doing things at a 10-year-old should not be doing. I've got a 10-year-old daughter. Now, I could never in a million years picture her doing these things, but these were things that were just ingrained in me because it was all I ever knew. And so my mum, again, in the background of this, was just broken. She was looking for love in all of the wrong places. The issue with my mum was that she just wanted somebody to love her and help her boys. And, she would quite often end up with people that seemed to want to help her boys and seemed to want to love her. But us boys would be so much chaos. There'd be so much police come into the house that they would end up either getting aggressive with my mum, or they would fall out, or my mum would end up breaking up with them, and then we would end up homeless and we would end up on the streets. And so I think by the time I was 10 years of age, I must have moved into about at least 15 houses. I never had a stable home. And so here I am, 10 years of age, looking at being homeless. My mum's boyfriend was abusive at this point, and this was the second relationship I can remember her being abused in. My brothers at this point were in and out of prison. They were committing crimes. My one brother moved away. And life was just chaos for me. I was left to my own devices with what I only knew, and what I knew was crime. What I knew was drugs. And my mum couldn't control me. And so my mum decided, right, we need to uproot, we need to move somewhere else, we need to try again, we need to start again. And so we moved 400 miles up the country. And so we moved from Pembrokeshire up to a place in mid Wales called Chepstow. And so we lived in Chepstow, which is quite a nice area. And we thought actually things might turn out all right here. But along the way while we were there, I ended up contracting meningitis, which almost took my life. I spent weeks in hospital. My mum, again, still broken, could barely look after herself properly, let alone look after his boys. My other brother was borderline psychologically affected by all the acid and magic mushrooms he had taken. My other brother, James, was serving a big prison sentence for GBH. And so we were just in a really bad place with no support. We didn't even know if you could get support at this point. And so I come out of hospital after surviving meningitis. And I think it was at that point where I kind of looked at my life and thought, I need to make the most of my life, but not in a good way. I need to live my life as much as I can and get as much out of my system as I can, because I'm not promised tomorrow. And so for me, instead of taking it on a positive step and saying, okay, I'm not promised tomorrow I'll start doing good things, I looked at it like, I'm not promised tomorrow I'm going to get what I need out of my system. And so I began to take more drugs. I can remember finishing school. I just joined comprehensive school, 13 years of age. And I met a friend. His name was Reese. We called him Skinny, because he was skinny. And then we had another friend who was Mark, who was fat, and we used to call him Fatty. So Skinny, Fatty, and me, we met up at the end of school, and we walked down to a friend's house, Bluey, and we asked Bluey for some ecstasy. And we knew that weekend there was going to be a rave on in the middle of a field. And so we decided that we were going to get a few ecstasy tablets each. And this was the first time we were ever going to take them. We're going to meet up at this field where this rave was going, and we were going to take them together. So 13 years of age, soon as school finishes, we collect these ecstasy tablets and we go up to a place called the Rec. And I decide that I'm going to take these pills. I drop one of the pills with a glass of water. My mate Skinny drops a pill with a glass of water. And my other friend drops a pill with a glass of water, Fatty. And so at this point, we're just waiting. We're not really feeling anything. We're not really, as if nothing's happening. Then all of a sudden, boom, start to come up off the ecstasy. And as I start to come up off the ecstasy, all I see in the distance was police lights. And I heard police dogs barking as they came to raid the rave that we were at. There was a police helicopter in the air, and all my friends started to run in one direction. And as they were running in the one direction, I started to run in the other direction, but I was so off my face because of the drugs that I ran straight into a wall and knocked myself out. I was the only one to get arrested that night. And so I found myself in the back of a police car, looking in the rear view mirror with a cut on my head. And that night left a mark on my life. And when I say it left a mark on my life, I don't mean the cut on my head. I mean, this was the beginning of taking Class A drugs. This was the beginning of trying something that I actually could not control. And so I yearned for that same kind of buzz over and over and over again. And so for the years that followed, I got kicked out of comprehensive school, where I hit the headmaster. I wouldn't turn up for home education. I had social services at the door. I was getting arrested for burglaries. I was getting arrested for thefts. My criminal record, my DBS, I've just had to send off for my DBS for a new job. And my DBS is 6 pages long. And when I say 6 pages long, the pages are like 2 A4 pages, back and front, full of criminal offences. And I don't say that pridefully. I say that because, God's grace is so good that he can forgive somebody like me. And so here we are, 13 years of age, taking ecstasy like nobody's business, smoking cannabis. My mum can't control me. My brothers are gone and not to be seen anywhere. In fact, my one brother, Simon, at this point had been sectioned. He had taken so much magic mushrooms that he believed the devil was trying to kill him. And right then, in that situation, I didn't think anything of it. But right now, I do believe that. I believe that he was in danger of not only losing his life, but losing his soul. And I've seen that destroy our family. It destroyed him. It destroyed my mum. It destroyed me. And that was probably the first time I really looked at drugs and thought, this probably isn't a good thing, but it wasn't enough to stop me. And so my brother came out of his psychiatric ward and he tried to live his life clean. My other brother was still in prison at this point, but I was still trying to make a name for myself. So I started selling drugs. I started picking up ecstasy tablets. I started picking up cocaine, and then it came crack, and then heroin, and then whatever I could make the most money out of. So 15 years of age, I'm selling crack and heroin for bigger dealers. I'm traveling up the country to Liverpool. I'm picking up big amounts of crack cocaine and heroin, and I'm bringing it back down, and I'm giving it to dealers, and we're sharing it out. And then I was basically a skivvy. I was running around with other people's big amounts of drugs and money, and I was handing it off because the blame had come to me. And so I did that for a while until I was 16, and I decided I was going to try the product. And so at this point was probably the most pivotal point to my criminal career that you could ever imagine. It was madness. So I'm sat on the back of a bus, a double-decker bus, on the way back from Liverpool with one of my friends, Jordan, and I decide I'm going to try the heroin. And so usually heroin is injected, or usually heroin is smoked on foil. I didn't have any of them, so I decided that I was going to sniff it. So I got a £20 note and I sniffed up the heroin, and it gave me a buzz and a feeling like I'd never had before. But the difference with this one is that I could not control it. I needed more. And every time, they call it chasing the dragon, because every one I had, I wanted more the next time. And every other one I had, I wanted more the next time, and the more the next time. And then I no longer became a drug dealer, but I became a drug user. And this was something that I said I would never be, is a heroin addict or a crack cocaine addict. They were seen as scum of the earth. And that was the sort of thing I never wanted to be, but that's the thing I became. And so I went home, and I was still living with my mum at this point. My oldest brother was still heavily into drugs, but living in North Wales. My other brother was doing okay at this point. He was, leading a normal-ish life. But my life changed from that moment onwards. I became what they call a prolific offender. That means I was so prolific with my offending that I had to be put on a specific register so I could be watched and monitored, so that I could be banned from town centres and city centres because of my criminal career. And so I couldn't go into towns, I couldn't go into cities that had banned me from them. So I started to do burglaries. So I started to rob people's homes. And so the scale of addiction matched the scale of my crime. The bigger my addiction, the bigger the crimes. And so I can remember my first burglary. And this first burglary was when I was just coming up 20 years of age. At this point, I'd been in and out of prison, doing 1 month here, 2 months there, a few weeks here. I had done drug programs. I was on methadone script. I was 5 stone wet through. I was sick to my stomach. Absolutely sick to my stomach. My mum didn't want to know me anymore. She had gone into a women's aid refuge, and my other brothers were just completely off the scale, except for Simon, who was doing okay at this point. And my life was just chaos. It was really chaos. And I was living in a bed sit at the time. And so I was living in Newport in this bed sit, and my life had literally just come to the brink of where it couldn't get any worse. I was either going to end up dead or back in prison. And I went and committed a burglary. And so this specific burglary is the one that sticks with me for life, because this is the one that made me think about the rest of my life. So I'm 20 years of age, and I'm with one of my mates, Ginge, and we're walking back and forth past this chip shop, Kibby's Fish and Chip Shop. And we know that there's a drug dealer that lives just above the chip shop in a flat, but we also know that he's gone away for the weekend. So we decide that we're going to rob his flat. So we go round to the back of the flat, we go up on top of his shed, and there's a window latch slightly open. So we're trying to reach it, we can't reach it. So Ginge grabs me by the legs and he pulls me up towards the window. And I'm like, I can't reach. And he pushes me up, and I ended up getting in. I get through this window. I go through into the bedroom and I pick up some jewelry. I go into the living room. There's nothing in the living room. And on my way back out, I look into the kitchen, and I got to remember is that I was really stoned. I'd been smoking cannabis all day and I had the munchies. And I looked through into the kitchen, and there's something that I wanted my whole entire life just sat there on the kitchen worktop. And it was a Mars bar. I was hungry. I knew what I wanted. So I ran over to the kitchen counter and I grabbed my chocolate bar. I grabbed the chocolate bar, I put it back in my pocket, and I went back to the window, and I looked down and I seen Ginger on the shed, and he said, "Have you got the stuff?" And I said to him with a smile on my face, "Yes, I got the stuff," and showed him the Mars bar. To his dismay, he was like, "Get beep, 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 get back in there, get the jewelry, get the drugs." I pulled the jewelry out and showed him what I had. It was a joke. And so I passed him the jewelry. We got down, and as we got down, he ran off with the jewelry because a neighbor came out with a torch. The neighbor came out with this torch, and he almost caught me. So I ran in the opposite direction and I went home. Well, when I went home, the police were already waiting for me.